Okay, good morning, everybody. Let's continue on in the laws of damages. And we had seen yesterday a discussion of how to evaluate the damage and how much the mazik has to pay. But let's continue on in the prohibition of causing damage to somebody else. So the Rav Shulchan Aruch had said that you're not allowed to damage someone else's property, afilu adas l'shalim, even if your intention in advance is that I'll damage it and I'll pay for it. Just like you're not allowed to steal with the intention of returning, so too you're not allowed to damage with the intent of compensating for the damage. It's still a Torah violation. And then he says, "Va'afilu ligrom nezek lechavero," and this is true even to cause damage to a friend without physically damaging, right? So what would be an example of causing causative damage? Bein b'ma'aseh, bein b'dibur asur. Whether it's done through action or through speech, anything that you do which generally causes a person to lose that something of value is considered to be nizikin, is considered to be damages. Kagon, an example of this would be Reuven shemocher schora l'nochri. Reuven has a regular transactional relationship with the non-Jew. Uba Shimon v'amer l'nochri she'ena shave kol kach. And Shimon comes along and tells the non-Jew who's a customer of Reuven, I don't see why you keep buying this product from Reuven. He's ripping you off. Okay, just a small statement like that, or shooting him an email saying, good luck with Reuven, and trying to get a good price from him. Okay, he says, Afal pisha ha'emes ito, even if Shimon is actually telling him the truth, that is still prohibited. Why? Shaharei, onas nachri muteres. He says, because halachically, Reuven can charge whatever he wants. There's to a non-Jew. There's not even a din of ona'ah, of overcharging. So that's the first example that we give. But before we go on to those examples, our discussion is going to be about causative damage. Now, causative damage quite often is not something that you can be forced to make restitution for, even though what you've done is an isser, and there's a debate as far as whether that's an isser de oraisa or an isser de rabbanan, but many poskim hold that that's even an isser de oraisa. The bottom line is that you're not allowed to do it. Okay, so the Imrei Yaakov, if we take a look, when he talks about ligrom nezek, to be gorein nezek. Now, there are the term of causative is grama, and there are actually two terms that the Gemara uses, which are from the same shoresh. One is grama and one is garmi. The only difference between those two words is the last letter of the word. Grama ends with the letter aleph, and garmi ends with the letter yud. They're slightly different levels of causative damage, and we're going to look in a few minutes as to what the difference between the two is. So the Imrei Yaakov says, Kaimalon, the grama b'nezikin pater b'dinei adam, that we paskin, that if you do causative damage, grama, then you cannot be sued in a court of law and be forced to pay. Masha'enkein garmi chayav gam b'dinei adam. But if it's less causative, and it's called garmi, that you are going to be held liable even in a court of law. The kaimalon karebi Meir the doim dina de garmi, because we paskin like Rebbe Meir, who says that a beis din can assess someone for causing garmi, a form of damage. We'll get into it just a moment. What's the difference between gram and garmi? He says, I'm going to explain in the biurim, which we'll take a look at momentarily, what the various principles that one needs to know. Number Aleph, he says, Mahu hageder shel grama umahu garmi. Number one, what is the difference between the two? Number two, ha'im dina de garmi hu de oraisa or de rabbanan? Is causative damage? Is it an isser de oraisa or is it an isser de rabbanan? Ma hadin begoreim de goreim. What would be the law if you are the cause of a cause? Number four, din sorek shtar chov shel chavero b'shogeg. What would be the halacha if you destroy your friend's promissory note unintentionally? You accidentally destroy your friend's promissory note, thus preventing him from collecting something that is of great value. That could also be qualified in some ways as causative damage, because you haven't destroyed actual property, but you've caused him to not be able to retrieve something that he's entitled to. Number five, Echadin imloka chashtar biyado leveso v'sham nisraf me'atzmo. What would be the halacha if you take the promissory note in your possession, bring it to your house, and then it burns on its own without you actually actively burning it? So that's a double grama. Okay, number six, kama dugmaot shel grama v'odam. And I'm going to give a number of examples of grama. And then he writes, so we'll take a look at that momentarily. Then he says, Kasav harama sof siman kufnun hey, and the Rama writes as follows: Shnei shchenim hadorim biyachad. So you have two neighbors. Ubeiso shel echad nifratz, v'al yedei zeh ba'im ganovim labayis hasheni. That the house of one of them has been left open, and so ganovim come to the house of Ruvain, and they ransack the house. But because they're in the neighborhood, and they had the opportunity to ransack Ruvain's house, they decide to ransack Shimon's house as well. So in other words, Ruvain has a very poor sense of security, and so he leaves his house vulnerable to attack of theft. And this causes the Ganovim not only to come to Ruvain's property, but also to the adjoining property. Va'amar hasheni gedor beisecha o mochrena la'acherim ki ato gorim li hezek. And so Shimon comes to Ruvain and he says, you either need to secure your property or sell your property to somebody else, because if you leave your property as it is, you're only going to be inviting more thievery from your house, and that's going to cause me damage as well, because if they're stealing from you, they're going to steal from me. That's the argument that Shimon presents. Now, it doesn't have to be a house. It could also be a field. It could be any kind of property where basically the dereliction of, securing Ruvain's house leads to thievery, not only in Ruvain's house, but in Shimon's house as well. So the question is, what's the halacha? I could think of not only thieves, but let's say, Ruvain has a rat trap, basically, or not a rat trap, but he leaves his house very dirty and invites rodents and other creatures to come to his house, and that causes damage to Shimon's house as well. So yesh omrim dahadin imo b'tzarich l'taken hezeko dahavi garmi v'yesh cholkim. Some say that that Shimon's claim is a valid claim, and some say that it's not a valid claim. And he doesn't explain why, but he basically says that this is an example of causative damage where there's a wide variety of opinions. So before we go, any further, we should we'll do one more point in the Imrei Yaakov. Ligrom nezek aser, because to cause damage to somebody else, even indirectly, is an isser. He says, Yesh omrim diyesh baze isser Torah over alav delo samad l'adam re'echa. Some say that it is even an isser deoraisa. What's the isser deoraisa? Do not stand idly by while your brother is bleeding out. And so what that means essentially is that if I am capable of saving someone from being damaged and I just don't, So even a passive act that causes damage is considered to be a liability for me. Okay, so on that basis, causative damage is going to be asur even midioraisa. So I just want to take a look at this biurim over here. He says, if you cause damage to someone else, even if you can exempt yourself b'dinei adam in a human court, you're still going to be chayiv b'dinei shamayim. You're going to be liable in the heavenly court. That was the language that we saw in the Rav Shulchan Aruch. So the Biurim writes over here, Aposkim ha'erichu b'dinei grama b'nezikin u'b'dinei garmi v'achilukim sheyesh beineihem. So there's quite an extensive amount of discussion in the poskim as far as what is called grama, what is called garmi, and the difference between them. Let's bring from them in short format some really important principles. So there's a commentary called Ha'ir Shushan, and in Siman Shin Pei Vav he writes the following: Yesh tzad b'mazik mamon chavero she'eno osa bo shum ma'aseh ela shebegramaso bo hanezek lachavero. There are certain times that you can cause monetary loss to your friend even when you're not doing any action whatsoever, but just through your causation, you are causing him damage. But there are times when the causation is more direct and where the causation is less direct. And when it's as if the damager has almost done it on his own, meaning that he's almost done it physically by himself, but there's just very, very little space removed. He says, "B'zeu shekro b'gemara garmi b'patach tachat hagimel," and that's what our sages call garmi, with the ah sound under the gimel, uv'yud b'sof v'chirik tachat hamem. So it's pronounced garmi. So that's when the causation is much closer to the actual damager. And sometimes the causation is very distant. In other words, there's very little connection between the damager and the damagee. To the point where that in a much more indirect way, damage happens to the damagee. And it's pronounced grama. And that's why, based on this, you appreciate the fact that the rabbis say that if you do a grama, if you do an indirect causation, so then you're going to be exempt, at least from a heavenly court. But we paskin like Rabbi Meir, who says that if you do a garmi, you're going to be chayiv. Shezehu kavanasim, that's what they're referring to. Garmi is more direct, and grama is more indirect. Umikol makom ein hadavar masur l'chol adam l'shar ezehu bichlal garmi ve'ezehu bichlal grama v'chulei ad kan l'sham. The problem is that this is very subjective, what is considered more direct and what is considered less direct. And therefore, unless this is subjected to sort of the scrutiny of the Beis Din, it would be very difficult for an individual to make that assertion on his own, that determination on his own, whether what he did was a grama or a garmi. So he says, Imdina de garmi hu medioraita. Is the prohibition of garmi, this more direct causation, is it a Torah prohibition? He says, Das haRamban sof bava basra u'maharshal perik hagozel kamasim chafav, the dina de garmi hu midine de oraisa. That the Ramban is of the opinion that you've committed a biblical prohibition. L'daitam hamochel shtarchovo hastorib sharchov shel chavero umeit chayav beno l'shalem. Based on that, so a more direct causative act is, let's say, if I destroy my friend's promissory note, that would be called a garmi because it's a more direct type of damage. And so, if a person does that and then he passes away, his son actually can be assessed and be liable to pay. And that's true even if it was done b'shogeg. Aval mi'idach das hakos Maimonides reish pei ches mehilchos chovel v'hamordechai v'chein hashach herich lechazek shitatam desvir lehu duhurak nasa midrabanan. But there are a whole string of other authorities that disagree with the Ramban, and they say that this is only rabbinic in nature. And the reason is the kansu b'makom shayanir lehem liknos, that it's a rabbinic penalty, that even though causation is always going to be pater midoraisa, the rabbis sometimes instituted a penalty on someone who does a direct causative act, kegon bedavar d'shchiach v'ragel, when it comes to things that are very prevalent that could easily happen. Ve'en ledamot gzerot chachamim zu lazu, and you cannot sort of extrapolate from one case to another because they're very complicated, and therefore all you have, ve'en lecha ela ma shamruhem, and all you can base yourself on are the exact cases that our sages present to us. Based on that, if you do a garmi damage by accident, we would not penalize you in a court of law. And they're basically arguments to bolster either side. But the bottom line is that this is also one of those gray areas when there's a more direct causation, and a person does that damage unintentionally, are they assessed for that damage in a Beis Din or not? That's also unclear, okay? So one thing that's unclear is what are the parameters of grama versus garmi? And number two is, what if a person commits a more direct causation unintentionally, will he still be assessed in Beis Din? Another issue, he says, is goreim de goreim. Od nechleku haposkim begoreim de goreim. That if you do such an indirect act that you cause a cause, the das balatrumos dehu patur v'hilcha chasholeach havara biad chereshota okata. So here's a cause of a cause, right? You go ahead and you give a flame, right? Like you give a hot coal in a pan to a person who is not of sound mind, either a small child or a person who's mentally impaired, okay? Visarfu shtaros, and they go ahead, the mentally impaired individual goes ahead and takes this hot coal and uses it to destroy not actual property, but let's say a promissory note that belongs to Reuven. So Shimon has done two indirect actions. In other words, you have to go back 2 steps to get back to Shimon. It's not 1 step, it's 2 steps. So first of all, he's the one who provided the flame to the mentally impaired individual. The mentally impaired individual, who's completely not responsible for their actions, goes ahead and destroys not actual property, but a promissory note. So the destruction of a promissory note in itself is a causation, but not direct damage. And it wasn't done directly by Shimon, but it was done indirectly because he provided the tool of destruction to a mentally impaired person. So this is called a grama de grama. Or gorem de gorem, I should say. It's 2 stages instead of 1 stage of grama. And the Ramban says that, so one opinion is that you're not going to be liable. Another opinion is that you will be liable. And so this is also the source of a machlokas. Another illustration is I steal a promissory note from somebody, and then by the time I'm caught, or that by the time I want to return it, it gets destroyed in my house, not through my own actions, but because of some mishap. So he says, so this is again, he says, when we say that when you steal someone else's promissory notes, or I'm sorry, if you incinerate someone else's promissory notes, the Gemara says that you're patur, because the Rabba lo doin dina de garmi, right? Because Rabba felt that was, even though that was a more direct causation, he felt that you're still patur in that case. Even though we paskin like Rabbi Meir, who will hold you liable, he says, Dezeh Mayri Davka de lo shakle biyade de lo havi gazlan. But that's only when you didn't take it yourself and steal it. O shahaya kfar biyado bepikadon, or let's say it had gotten into your hands legally. Avalim shakle biyade va'agbe havi gazlan l'kulei alma. But if I go ahead and I take someone else's promissory notes illegally, I steal them, for example, v'hashava boy lemevad v'chayv l'kulei alma afilu l'rabba, and therefore I have an obligation to return those promissory notes. And then in that situation, that if those promissory notes accidentally get destroyed, then I'm going to be chayav. Okay, so again, this is another area of controversy. And then in this next piece, he says the difference between garmi and grama. He says, "Hot the kaimelan de danim dina de garmi, nechleku haposkim be'eza inyan zenemar." So he says this is again a gray area that the poskim discuss and dispute with each other. He says the besorev shtar chov shel chavero. He says if you incinerate your friends, Shimon goes ahead and incinerates Ruvain's promissory note. V'chein hamocher shtar chov lechavero v'chazra umachla. Or let's say if you you go ahead, if you sell a promissory note to somebody else, and he goes ahead with that right of usage of or to use the promissory note, and he goes ahead and he forgives the note. Alma l'shalem et nizko. So in all of those cases, in other words, let's say you agreed to pay the guy for the promissory note, he gives you the note, and then instead of paying him, you go ahead and you forgive the note to the debtor. So in all of those cases, you've caused a real causative damage, but it's a direct causation, and therefore you have to pay for the damages. These are examples of garmi. But he says, but let's say I position the coin of my friend at the edge of the shore, of the seashore, to the point where it is so close to the shoreline that once the water starts to come out more, it sweeps away my friend's coin. He says, and I haven't picked up the coin. I just moved it with my foot, so I haven't tried to be kona it in any way, and I just do a causative act of loss. Or v'chein hapoches matbea shel chavero behevir tsuraso v'lo chasro b'mishkal. Or let's say I do another kind of physical act where I deface my friend's coin so that it can't be used as legal tender anymore, but I haven't in any way removed its value as a piece of precious metal. He says, that might also be an example based on currency systems in the ancient world. V'chein hazori klishalo merosh hagag lamata v'hayu tachtav karimu chsasot. she'im yipol aleihem lo yishaver. Here's another example of causation. Reuven takes an object that belongs to him and has set up, he's on the rooftop, and he set up cushions to be able to throw something from his rooftop to the ground without it breaking. Because let's say he's doing some kind of construction project, or he needs to do some moving, and it's too difficult for him to schlep it all the way downstairs. So he decides he's going to throw his baby grand piano from the rooftop to the ground. But he sets up a whole system of cushions to cushion the fall of the baby grand so that it won't break. Okay? And v'kadam acher v'silkam v'nechbat hakli ba'aretz v'nishvar. And then Shimon comes along and pulls away the pillows. So that's also causative, right? In other words, I haven't destroyed his baby grand. He threw the baby grand off the roof, but I just took away the cushions to prevent its fall, to prevent it from having a soft landing. So b'chol elu das harambam v'hashulchan aruch b'chayev mishum dahavi garmi. So the Rambam is of the opinion that these are more direct causations, and therefore you're going to be chayev. Aval das harosh v'chein pirush harama the elu mikri grama b'nezikenu potter. But there are other opinions, the Rosh, quoted by the Rama, who say that this is more indirect causation. So you see, it's very subtle. What is considered direct causation, and what is considered indirect causation? Okay, let me just skip a little bit. He says, there are other cases which are clearly considered to be grama, that is indirect causation, and everyone will agree that you're pater, b'dinei adam, which means that you cannot be sued for it in court, but you still be held liable in heaven. Let's say you go ahead and you sick your friend's dog on another person. Okay, so you've caused both sides damage because you've enabled your friend's dog to go ahead and cause damage to Shimon, and let's say it's Levi's dog. Levi will now be held liable as well. Or another example would be or let's say you give a censer pan with a coal into the hands of someone who's mentally impaired, and they go ahead and v'libuha, and they go ahead and they cause it that. In other words, this is not a flame, but it is a coal, and they go ahead and take the mentally impaired person takes a hot coal and causes it to ignite more. In other words, intensifies its flame. So this is again more indirect causation. Or v'chein hatzoik ba'ozen chavero v'chersho. Or here's another example. Let's say you scream into someone else's ear, and you cause them to become hearing impaired because you take like a huge noise and you blow it into their ear. Like you take a foghorn, one of those really loud things, and you put it up right to your friend's ear, and you turn it, you press it, and he becomes deaf as a result. So that also you'll be pater b'dinei adam. You cannot be sued for that. But obviously, all of these things you'll be held liable for in heaven, but this is not considered to be direct enough of a damage for you to be sued in a court of law. Here's another example. I put poison in my neighbor's pet's dog food bowl. I didn't force the dog to eat from the dog food. I just put poison in the dog food. That's called grama, and therefore I'm going to be pater. Okay? Or I mix poison into its food. Okay? Another example. The Sogar Alav Hadelas Ubitlo Mimalachto. Let's see. Avolim Harikfar Becheder V'Sogar Alav Milatzes Dine Adam. Oh, let's say I invite my friend into a courtyard and I lock the door on him, preventing him from being able to do his work. So chayav. So then I'm going to be liable for, I'm not sure what he means, chayav b'Shabbos or b'Shavas. Avalim hayikfar b'cheder. The Sagar love me. Oh, I see. He says, if I forcibly bring someone into a room and I lock the door and I prevent him from being able to do his work and that causes him financial loss, then I will be held liable for the financial loss that I caused him. But, he says, but if the friend was already in the room and all I did was lock the door, but I didn't force him to go into the room, so that's called grama, and I'm going to be pater midine adam. So these are all different examples that he's given of causative acts. All right, I think we'll hold it here for today. I think you were getting the gist of what we mean by causative acts. Sometimes you'll be liable, sometimes you won't be liable. There's not a very strong line of demarcation, but one thing is clear is that the only time that you can be held liable b'dinei adam is if the causation is very, very direct. Doing the act directly yourself, or just being very, very slightly removed, then you'll be held liable. If it's more indirect, you're going to be pater, but you're only pater b'dinei adam in a court of law, but you'll still be held liable in the eyes of Hashem. And according to many poskim, it's an Isser Deoraisa. Okay?
Rabbi, the only one that I'm really struggling with, I think, is the blowing the sound into someone's ear. That seems very direct. Is that one we said you're pater?
Yeah, you're going to be pater b'dinei adam. Yeah. And the question is why? So I suppose it has to do with the way that you interpret the damage. There's been no physical damage, at least according to Chazal's understanding of what happens when a person goes deaf. It could be, if physicians today could identify that through the blowing of the foghorn you actually ruptured the eardrum, then perhaps that would be different. But I think that what the way Chazal view it is that if a person goes deaf, perhaps because of something psychosomatic, and they didn't really understand the direct cause of the sound and the damage that's done to the inner ear.
That's helpful. Thank you.
All right.